August 7th, 1944. The Norwegian Sea. 170 miles northeast of North Cape. The fog hung low and greasy over the Arctic waters, turning the vast expanse of the Norwegian Sea into a monochrome canvas of grey. On the bridge of HMCS Nabob, a British-built Bogue-class escort carrier leased to the Royal Canadian Navy, Lieutenant Commander John Jack Fotheringham peered anxiously into the gloom. The rhythmic thrum of the carrier's engines was a comforting, dull vibration beneath his feet. Nabob was a baby flat top, a vital component of Operation Offspring, a mission to hunt and destroy German shipping and U-boats operating out of occupied Norway. The Canadians, though relatively inexperienced in carrier warfare, ran a taut ship. Below deck, the Grumman Wildcats and Swordfish torpedo bombers of 852 Naval Air Squadron sat fully fueled, ready for launch. Fotheringham felt the deep, bone-chilling cold of the Arctic. But the greater anxiety came from the knowledge that they were operating in the home waters of the deadliest German weapon, the U-boat. They were far from friendly air cover, and the fog that protected them from the Luftwaffe also concealed predators beneath the waves. Down in the cramped, oily control room of U-354, Kapitän Lieutenant Hans-Jürgen Stur had been patiently hunting for days. Stur, a veteran of several successful patrols, had been tracking the persistent, distant ping of Allied sonar. He knew a convoy or a high-value target was nearby. Then, the fog lifted momentarily. Through his periscope, Stur saw it, the blunt, rectangular shape of a smaller aircraft carrier, surrounded by a tight screen of destroyers and frigates. It was a priceless prize, likely worth millions. He barked orders. Prepare Tube 5, electric torpedo, depth set to 10 meters. Stur was about to launch not a standard torpedo, but the new, terrifying German weapon, the T-5 Zaunkönig, or Wren. This was an acoustic homing torpedo, designed to listen for and hunt the propeller noise of its target. It was fast, quiet, and virtually impossible to evade aboard the Nabob. Fotheringham suddenly heard the frantic, high-pitched scream of the active sonar from the lead frigate. Contact! Fast! Closing! And too close! Fotheringham grabbed the ship's telephone. Hard rudder to port, all ahead flank. But it was too late. The Zaunkönig was programmed to seek noise, and the carrier's huge propellers were the loudest thing in the ocean. A colossal, deafening crack ripped through the ship's hull, immediately followed by the sickening, deep thump of the explosion that rattled every rivet and fixture. The shock was blinding. Men were thrown from their feet. Lights instantly winked out, plunging the rear third of the ship into absolute blackness. The explosion had struck the starboard side, directly beneath the two massive propeller shafts, adjacent to the engine room and near the aft magazine. Water instantly began to pour in, not in a gentle stream, but in a devastating torrent. On the bridge, the smell of burnt electrical wiring and hydraulic fluid was immediate. Fotheringham grabbed the rail, shouting, "Damage report! Damage report! Now!" The response was grim. The aft engine room was already flooding. The starboard propeller was instantly useless, the shaft bent or broken. The ship was listing heavily to starboard. But the most terrifying news came from the engineering section. The torpedo had blown a monstrous 32-foot hole in the side of the ship, just above the waterline, tearing the steel like cheap cloth. The consensus from the panicked engineers was immediate. "Sir, we have catastrophic hull damage. The flooding is uncontrollable. Prepare to abandon ship." The Nabob, worth the equivalent of over $200 million in modern currency, was clearly doomed. But the Canadian crew, led by their unflappable captain, was about to reject fate and attempt an act of desperate, technically insane salvage. August 7th, 1944. Engine room and aft section, HMCS Nabob. The immediate aftermath of the torpedo strike was utter pandemonium contained within the terrifying darkness of the ship's lower decks. The acoustic torpedo, the T-5 Zaunkönig, had done its deadly work with surgical precision, exploding precisely where the nabob was most vulnerable. The gash on the starboard quarter was immense, a brutal tear measuring 32 feet long and exposing the interior to the freezing, violent ingress of the Norwegian Sea. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" Davidson, a dour, methodical man from Halifax, found himself waist-deep in swirling, oil-slicked water within minutes. He knew the ship's design intimately. The nabob, a modified freighter hull, was structurally less resilient than a true warship. The immense hole meant that the surrounding bulkheads, already weakened by the blast shock, were straining to hold back the ocean. If just one more critical bulkhead failed, the rapid, progressive flooding would tip the large, heavy carrier over and send it to the bottom within minutes. "No, sir, the hole is too large. We're losing the stern compartment and the aft tank spaces." A rating yelled over the cacophony of rushing water and straining metal. "The list is at 8 degrees and climbing." "Captain Horace, sir." Rayner, commanding the nabob, maintained a quiet, almost unnerving calm on the bridge. He listened to Davidson's strained reports. Abandoning ship was the logical, safe choice. But abandoning a $200 million asset, the vital component of an active anti-submarine operation, was unthinkable if there was even a fractional chance of saving her. Rayner looked at the damage control diagrams. The ship was listing heavily to starboard, dragging its broken stern lower into the water, which increased the risk of the flooding spreading. The standard procedure was to seal the damaged compartments and attempt to pump out the water. But with a 32-foot hole, sealing was impossible, and the pumps were already overwhelmed. That's when Davidson, working deep in the engine room, proposed the insane maneuver. It flew in the face of all conventional naval wisdom regarding damage control, which prioritized watertight integrity above all else. "Captain," Davidson's voice crackled over the emergency circuit, filled with static and urgency. "We cannot pump out the water, so we must use the water to fight the ship's list. I propose counter-flooding the port side fuel tanks and voids. We flood the good side to stabilize the wounded side." The plan was revolutionary and incredibly dangerous. Intentionally flooding undamaged sections of the ship meant sacrificing critical stability margins. If Davidson miscalculated the amount of water needed, or if the port side bulkheads failed under the added, deliberate strain, the ship would roll over to port and capsize instantly. It was a calculated risk that gambled the ship's stability on the structural integrity of bulkheads that were never designed to hold the pressure of fully flooded compartments. "It will put us down far lower in the water. Sir, we'll be slower, almost defenseless," Fotheringham warned. Rayner looked out at the churning, hostile Norwegian Sea, then back at the list indicator, which was creeping past 10 degrees. "Do it, Chief. Control the flooding. Counter-flood the port side tanks D and E. Balance her. Do whatever you must to keep her level and floating." Davidson and his damage control teams, working in the freezing, dark interior, opened the required seacocks on the undamaged port side. The sound of water deliberately rushing into the port tanks was terrifying. It sounded like the ship committing suicide. Slowly, agonizingly, the ship's list to starboard began to diminish. The level of the internal flooding rose, but the list stabilized. Davidson had deliberately created a nearly level, but critically deep, waterplane for the carrier. The nabob was now riding dangerously low in the water, nearly a third of her aft hull submerged, but she was relatively stable. The Canadian crew had fought the ocean to a draw, using the ocean itself as their weapon. The task now shifted from surviving the immediate damage to achieving the near impossible, taking this wounded, lumbering giant on a 1,100-mile journey back to safety, navigating the U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. August 7th, 9th, 1944. The Barents Sea, North Atlantic route. The successful counter-flooding had stabilized the Nabob, pulling the list back to a manageable 2 degrees, but it left the ship wallowing, riding far lower in the water than designed. Her stern was barely above the freezing waves. In the 32-foot torpedo hole, now partially submerged by the flooding, remained a gaping wound threatening to tear further under the stress of the open ocean. Captain Rayner immediately recognized the next critical phase, mitigating the drag and ensuring the hole didn't propagate under stress. The Nabob was designed for speed and rapid aircraft deployment. Now, it was a slow, crippled target. Chief Davidson's damage control teams, exhausted and working under immense psychological pressure, launched into the next insane salvage act, attempting to temporarily patch a massive hull breach while at sea, a feat usually reserved for the relative safety of a dry dock. They improvised a massive, temporary patch using collision mats, thick, heavy canvas sheets designed to cover much smaller shrapnel holes, reinforced with timbers and secured by cables stretched around the carrier's enormous girth. It was a grueling, terrifying endeavor. Divers and engineers worked precariously close to the massive, submerged tear, fighting the icy water and the dangerous movement of the compromised hull. They managed to affix the makeshift patch, dramatically slowing the inward rush of water, allowing the pumps, now functioning in coordination with the counter-flooding, to maintain the precarious balance. Meanwhile, the operational challenge was equally severe. The torpedo blast had knocked out the main electrical power to the stern, damaged the rudder mechanism, and rendered the starboard propeller shaft useless. The ship's speed was drastically reduced to a pitiful 10 knots, and her maneuverability was severely compromised. Lieutenant Commander Fotheringham reported from the bridge. "Captain, we are only running on the port shaft. The rudder is damaged, and the heavy drag from the submerged stern and the patch is making us handle like a barge in treacle. To make matters worse, the pursuit was on. Capitaine Lieutenant Stur, aboard U-354, knew he had hit a carrier and was determined to finish the job." The Nabob's escort screen, comprised of destroyers like HMCS St. Laurent and HMCS Gatineau, went into a relentless, hours-long hunt, dropping depth charges to keep the U-boat at bay. The constant explosions shook the wounded carrier, threatening to dislodge the improvised patch and trigger the very bulkheads Davidson had so cleverly stressed with counter-flooding. Captain Rayner made his final, critical decision for the long voyage home to the nearest friendly port, Scapa Flow, some 100 miles away. Given the damage to the stern, the drag, and the compromised steering, Rayner ordered the ship to sail backwards. The rationale was simple. If bizarre, sailing stern first would reduce the stress on the damaged hull plates and the temporary patch by using the more streamlined bow to cut through the water. It was an unconventional, even absurd maneuver for a $200 million aircraft carrier, but it was the best way to keep the ship intact. The HMCS Nabob, riding low, listing slightly, and shuddering with every movement of her single propeller, began her long, slow, backwards crawl across the hostile North Atlantic. For the Canadian crew, the fight was no longer about combat. It was a desperate, 3-week engineering battle against the ocean, the structural fatigue of their crippled ship, and the lurking threat of Stur's U-boat pack. They had defied the torpedo. Now they had to defy the ocean itself. August 9th, August 21st, 1944. The North Atlantic convoy route. The journey was a testament to human endurance against technical impossibility. For 2 grueling weeks, the Canadian crew of the HMCS Nabob existed in a perpetual state of emergency. The ship's survival depended entirely on the continued stability provided by the intentional flooding and the integrity of the improvised hole patch. The engine room, commanded by Chief Davidson, became the beating, desperate heart of the ship. With the starboard engine room flooded and sealed, the remaining port engine had to be nursed continually to maintain the slow, shuddering backward progress. The crew worked in stifling heat and constant noise, fighting leaks that sprung up daily in stressed bulkheads, and constantly monitoring the levels of the counter-flooded tanks. A single shift in ballast could mean catastrophe. The conditions below decks were horrific, with much of the ship's aft section devoted to holding seawater for stability. Sanitary conditions deteriorated rapidly. The lack of air conditioning and ventilation, combined with the extreme humidity and heat generated by the working engine, made the air thick and unbearable. Exhaustion became the greatest threat after the U-boats. The damage control teams were pushed to the absolute breaking point, their hands raw from handling tools, their sleep measured in 2-hour snatches. Meanwhile, high above the flooding and the structural strains, the ship's operational function had been critically curtailed. The aft lift was disabled, trapping many of the Grumman Wildcats and Swordfish below the flight deck. The limited runway space meant flying operations were suspended. The carrier, designed to project power, was reduced to a slow, vulnerable hulk protected only by the tireless vigilance of its Canadian escort screen. The true moment of triumph in this leg of the journey came from an unexpected source, the persistent escort ships. Captain Lieutenant Sturr, aboard U-354, continued his relentless pursuit for 2 days, determined to claim his kill. But the Canadian destroyers and frigates, particularly HMCS Assiniboine and HMCS Qu'Appelle, executed a brilliant, concentrated search. On August 10th, they finally located Sturr's boat. A savage depth charge attack followed, forcing the U-boat to the surface. Though the destroyers could not confirm the kill immediately, the pressure was immense. The final confirmation came from a ferry Swordfish launched from a different carrier in the task force. U-354 had been destroyed. The constant, terrifying shadow of the U-boat commander who had crippled them was finally lifted. The sailors on the HMCS Nabob felt a wave of cold relief, but the battle to save the ship was far from over. The remaining 1,000 miles of the journey were a test of patience, discipline, and nerve. Every wave, every squall, every change in sea state threatened to overwhelm the precarious balance achieved by Davidson's counter-flooding. The crew's morale was sustained by the simple, powerful knowledge that they had defied the odds. They had been written off, sunk by the most advanced torpedo the Germans possessed, yet they were moving backwards, slowly, but moving toward the safety of the British Isles. As the Canadian crew entered the final stretch of the journey, they had already achieved what every naval engineer had deemed impossible, sailing a large warship home with a catastrophic, unpatchable hole. Sustained by nothing but the crew's ingenuity and a calculated act of self-flooding, the ship was saved. But the fate of the HMCS Nabob as a fighting vessel remained uncertain. August 21st, 1944. Scapa Flow Naval Base, Orkney Islands, Scotland. The site of the Orkney Islands, rising darkly out of the cold North Sea mist, brought an overwhelming wave of silent relief to the bridge of the HMCS Nabob. After 2 weeks and half 100 nautical miles of crawling backwards across the submarine-infested North Atlantic, the crippled aircraft carrier finally limped into the vast, protected harbor of Scapa Flow, the primary base of the British home fleet, as the tugs nudged the massive, low-riding hull toward the repair berths. The scope of the crew's achievement was laid bare for the assembled naval authorities. The sight of the carrier, her stern dangerously submerged, her paint scarred, and the crude canvas and timber patch clinging precariously to the massive 32-foot torpedo gash, drew immediate and astonished attention Naval engineers and damage control experts from the Royal Navy and the Canadian Navy swarmed the wounded ship, eager to study the incredible feat of improvisation. The official surveys confirmed the severity of the damage. The torpedo explosion had not only destroyed the starboard shaft and engine room, but had subjected the entire aft structure to forces that should have resulted in immediate foundering. Lieutenant Commander Davidson's insane decision to counter-flood the portside fuel tanks, sacrificing watertight integrity for crucial hydrodynamic stability, was lauded as a brilliant, if unconventional, act of damage control that had directly prevented the progressive flooding and capsize. Captain Rayner's equally audacious decision to sail the ship's stern first had minimized the hydrodynamic stress on the wounded aft section, preserving the integrity of the crucial, weakened bulkheads for the duration of the journey. The Canadian crew, initially deemed a junior, inexperienced addition to the crucial carrier fleet, had demonstrated a level of ingenuity, tenacity, and discipline that defied the standards of conventional naval warfare. They had fought the ocean itself and won. However, despite the heroic salvage, the damage was too severe and widespread for battlefield repairs. The Canadian government, facing immense repair costs and shifting wartime priorities, decided against a full restoration. The HMCS Nabob, though saved from the depths, would never return to active service. She was decommissioned, becoming a floating reserve, and was eventually scrapped after the war. The ship, worth over $200 million in modern value, was physically saved but militarily lost. Yet, the legacy of the HMCS Nabob was not measured in her remaining service time, but in the moral victory and the preservation of her crew. The nearly 900 Canadian personnel who served aboard were saved from a potentially catastrophic loss of life in the Arctic waters. Their act of impossible salvage became a classic case study in naval damage control, demonstrating that human ingenuity and decisive, unconventional leadership could overcome what engineering blueprints deemed inevitable. The story of the Canadian crew, who patched a massive torpedo hole, deliberately flooded their own ship, and sailed a crippled carrier backwards for over 1,000 miles, remains one of the most remarkable and unsung feats of naval endurance in the Second World War. It was the triumph of a single, determined crew who refused to accept defeat, proving that the most valuable asset in any conflict is not the cost of the steel, but the skill and daring of the men who sail it.